Welcome to the DebateDrills Academy. This is Rafi Piliero, and I'm here with Jack Johnson. Today we're going to be analyzing the debate from Blake Finals in 2020. Jack, how are you doing today?
I'm doing good. Really excited to watch myself lose.
It's always painful. So, the way we're going to be going through this, we'll go speech by speech, listening to the debate. We won't be providing commentary during the speech, of course. I'll be flowing. You'll be able to see my flow right here. And then after each speech, what we'll do is we'll provide some commentary. Anything you want to add before we jump into the debate, Jack?
No, I've watched this round a bunch of times, have a bunch of thoughts, a bunch of regrets. So yeah, I'm excited to get into it.
All right, let's get started then.
Terrorism. Venezuela is a crucial safe haven for the terror group Hezbollah. Savage in 2019 writes that Venezuela is a key transit point for cocaine, and Hezbollah has an important network of supportive businesses in Venezuela with connections to Colombia, Panama, and the Dutch Antilles, which are then used to money launder drug revenues. If Hezbollah and Iran were to lose Venezuela, many of their ongoing ops in Latin America would suffer. Sanctions eliminate financing for Hezbollah. Newman in 2019 writes that the U.S. sanctions on Venezuela have had a secondary effect on Hezbollah's financing, degrading their military and terrorist capabilities. Maduro's military-backed cartel scrambles for cash to get around the sanction. Disrupting Venezuela's financing of criminal and terrorist groups would help improve security not only in the Western Hemisphere but in the Middle East as well. Hezbollah is a real threat, and as the Counter-Extremism Project reports, that Hezbollah threatened millions of civilians in 2006 in the Middle East alone. This threat extends to the entire Western Hemisphere. As Singer in 2018 writes, Hezbollah has built up its presence in Latin America, posing a wider danger to the Americas aimed at our very doorsteps. Hezbollah poses a serious danger to the entire civilized world, and the West must prevent this terrorist group from building its strategic base in Central and South America. The international community must do everything possible to make sure that the Western Hemisphere does not become the next terrorist battleground. Contention to his military intervention. Hodgson in 2019 explains that Venezuela is now in a stalemate that gives two bad options: another Cuba with poverty for generations, or a military intervention akin to Panama in 1989. Thankfully, Trump is deciding against military intervention. Jiren in 2019 explains that Mr. Trump has said in recent days that Mr. Bolton wants to get him into a war. That's why the AFP writes last week that Secretary of State Mike Pompeo made clear that the United States did not plan a military intervention in Venezuela. Instead, Telesur in 2017 reports that the President of the Assembly explained Trump's financial sanctions are an alternative to military intervention against the Venezuelan people. That's for three reasons. The first is political support. Groff in 2019 explains that no Republican presidential candidate has won the White House in nearly a century without carrying Florida, a state known for its razor-thin election margins. Trump's tough stance on Maduro is very popular in Florida among the state's Cuban and Venezuelan populations. Trump knows that he needs a hardline stance on Venezuela for the sake of his re-election, and it's either sanctions or war. Wells in 2019 finds that disgruntled Venezuelans compose a swing constituency and a swing state in the 2020 elections, and Groff continues that South Florida is one of the few areas or regions of the country in which foreign policy is a domestic political factor in how people vote. Second is oil. Absent sanctions, Trump is willing to go to war for oil, citing a quote from Trump in 2017. Ward of this February writes that Trump wanted to go to war in Venezuela because, quote, they have all that oil. Instead of war, Trump is pursuing harsher sanctions. Roche in 2019 explains that the U.S. hit PDVSA, Venezuelan state-owned oil company, with sweeping sanctions, and experts argue that the U.S. government is concerned with taking control of the oil market. By sanctioning PDVSA, Trump is decimating a major rival of U.S. oil interests. Owler lists PDVSA is a key competitor against Chevron, ExxonMobil, and Shell. Third is the Monroe Doctrine. The Maduro government has become a disastrously threatening Russian proxy in America's sphere of influence. Aries in 2019 explains that Russia's interest in investment in Venezuela is primarily geopolitical, and it's an instrument for exacting costs on the United States in its home region, and so Russia digs in behind Maduro. For this reason, Jacobs et al. In 2019 writes that Trump and his advisors have determined that there is only one credible U.S. approach: more aggressive efforts to pressure Maduro. Indeed, under the pretense of safeguarding America's sphere of influence, Haynes in 2019 writes that the U.S. has intervened in Latin American elections, civil wars, and revolutions at least 56 times. However, sanctions neutralize the Venezuelan threats, making military intervention unnecessary. Aries continues that as things go south for Maduro, Russia loses access to the largest oil reserves on the planet, and it also loses a convenient toehold in the Americas, which they can counter U.S. Interest in the region. The impact is devastating. Mora 19 writes that a precision strike operation would last for months, destroying what remains of Venezuela's economy. The result would be anarchy, and more than 8 million Venezuelans would likely flee. The chaos would likely lead the United States to send in ground troops and be there for years. Thus, we negate.
What are some of your preliminary thoughts about some of the strategy here? What you think really the strategy is going to be for the debate?
Yeah. So the strategy behind this case is sort of as follows. I am a big proponent of taking advantage of predictability that exists on topics. So this topic is that the United States should lift its sanctions on Venezuela, which means that essentially every affirmative argument is economic. At least those are all of the best affirmative arguments because they're clearly the most intuitive and the most one-sided, right? Especially from the perspective of Venezuela's own economy. Obviously, these sanctions are really bad for Venezuela's economy. So this case was built to beat that case, right? And the reason for this is that this case doesn't try to prove that somehow sanctions are like good, are a net economic good. Instead, they tried to prove that sanctions prevent a much more massive harm, which is some sort of large scale conflict. And we sort of did it with two contentions. The first one is a very speculative terrorism contention, and then the second one, which is the one that we really liked, and the one that is clearly much more developed, which with several links and impacts, is the military intervention contention. And so that's the strategy. We figured we would lose on the econ impact debate, so we tried to get really ahead on the conflict impact debate, and that's what this case tried to do.
What I really like about this second contention as well is that it does a very good job setting up a uniqueness story here. That's just like, look, conflict is inevitable. If it's not going to happen, I guess conflict's not inevitable, but U.S. action is inevitable. If it's not sanctions, it will be intervention, which is more destabilizing. And the case then sets up several different scenarios for why the U.S. will intervene, like going to war over oil, political support, the Monroe Doctrine, which then establishes that, like, the U.S. will do something. Sanctions are less destabilizing, which then non-uniques a lot of offense that could be read against this.
Right, exactly.
What do you think the approach in cross-examination will be?
Honestly, I don't really remember it that well. I think probably the smartest approach would be to interrogate why exactly the only two options are sanctions or war. I think that's probably the biggest chink in the armor here. I think there's many things we could technically do to counterbalance and hedge against the Venezuelan threat that aren't like literally invading their homeland, because you can do things like, say, cyber attacks. You can do things like posturing in international institutions. I think that's probably the biggest weakness to this case.
Let's take a look and find out.
We affirm that our sole contention is the economy. Rodriguez 18 finds that last year, Venezuela's export revenues rose from $28 to $32 billion, buoyed by the recovery in world oil prices. Under normal conditions, a rise in a country's exports would leave it with more resources to pay for its imports. In the Venezuelan case, imports fell by 31% during the same year. Sanctions hurt the economy for two reasons. Subpoint A is oil. Elliott 19 finds that Venezuela is relying on oil for 98% of its export earnings. Praga 18 finds that Venezuela's oil exports sank 40% in the first full month after the beginning of U.S. sanctions designed to oust socialist President Nicolas Maduro. The Economist 19 finds that Venezuela's oil imports are reportedly acquired through swaps and intermediaries that can cost about 30% more than regular market transactions. This further reduces PDVSA's cash flow. Zuniga 19 finds that Venezuela's oil output has continued to dwindle under sanctions and is at its lowest level since the 1940s. Venezuela's increasing lack of access to supplies of naphtha, which is used to dilute heavy oil and move it through pipelines, means it will not be selling at a different, less profitable domestically produced blend of oil. Worse still, Benaldi 19 finds that diverting oil exports to India and China, as Venezuela has been doing, implies higher transportation costs and selling at a discount to capture markets. Overall, Weisbrot 18 finds that the Trump sanctions had an enormous impact on oil production by 700,000 barrels a day, about 3 times as fast as it had fallen over the previous 20 months. Emersberger 19 quantifies the difference in total revenue between the sanction and no sanctions case over the 12-month period is about $6 billion. Crucially, Benziquin 17 finds that oil revenues enable the government to import most consumer goods. Top Venezuelan economist Rodriguez says the Trump administration's sanctions have cost Venezuela $16.9 billion per year and caused food shortages that threaten hundreds of thousands of deaths. Subpoint B is debt. Venezuela has a lot of debt. Eve 19 writes that external debt in a collapsing country has more than doubled over the past decade. Malati 19 writes that Venezuela's economic reconstruction will require large-scale international financial assistance and external debt restructuring to stabilize the economy and lay the foundations for sustained long-term growth. Unfortunately, Cardman 18 of the International Economic Policy finds that the presence of U.S. sanctions against Venezuela and a number of key Venezuelan government officials pose 2 significant obstacles to a debt restructuring. First, under existing U.S. sanctions, it would be virtually impossible for U.S. creditors to negotiate a debt restructuring with the Venezuelan negotiating team. Second, in addition to the sanctions, U.S. bondholders would not be able to participate in any bond exchanges. For this reason, Wise Row 19 finds the August 2017 sanctions prohibited the Venezuelan government from restructuring its foreign debt. Lifting sanctions and allowing Venezuela to restructure their debt will lift millions out of poverty. Fontes 18 finds that the restructuring of Venezuela's external debt will enable Venezuela's economy to grow at double-digit rates. Moati 19 of Harvard finds that Venezuela's economic reconstruction will lay the foundations for sustained long-term growth. Historically, our Luco 6 finds that the rapid growth of the Venezuelan economy in 2004 and 2005 pulled millions of people out of poverty. Empirics prove. McCoff 17 finds that Mexico, Colombia, and Chile and others have enjoyed steady growth and established full financial independence while adhering to a market approach. Venezuela can follow suit.
About this case. So my initial thought, I'm interested if you agree with this, Jack, is that it seems like, everything relies on the economy. That's the only argument they're making, obviously. But it seems like they do have two somewhat separated internal links to it. One about export earnings and one about, debt restructuring. But it seems like the weaker part of this, perhaps at the level of the impact, that one potential way of attack is just to say, U.S. intervention's inevitable. That will hurt the Venezuelan economy as well. Sanctions are less bad. What do you think, though, about this case?
I totally agree. I think there's a lot of very solid warrant analysis as to why exactly sanctions prevent the most common and most realistic governmental solutions to economic crises from happening. But yeah, I definitely think that when you really probe into the impact level, it gets a little bit weak. It's essentially just like a nebulous, X number of millions of people get lifted out of poverty and then maybe hundreds of thousands die, which of course that's certainly not a bad impact in a vacuum. But when that's the only impact to your entire case, all 4 minutes of it, then from a technical perspective, you're certainly not as diversified as you should be. And you sort of set yourself up for the strategy that I use in rebuttal, which sort of just goes super hard on weighing against the just generic econ impact type stuff.
And that was one of the things I thought was strong about the Khan case. It's diversified at the level of internal links, in that there are, for example, several reasons why military intervention will happen, but it's not all the eggs in the military intervention basket, right? There's also this terrorism thing, so that it's not really susceptible to losing on impact comparison, and it's not also susceptible to losing on just internal link and solvency presses. It's diversified at multiple different levels.
Right. Yeah, that's absolutely true. The interesting thing is that university, as I recall, was probably the best lay team in the country. And we had a weird panel. We had a panel where it was 2 or 3 FLAY judges and then 2 tech judges. So the panel really wasn't that clearly technical. And whenever you get FLAY judges or lay judges, they actually tend to reward a more narrative style case. And that means sometimes that when you drop a bunch of different internal links and separate arguments, that can actually hurt you because now, you're making a ton of different arguments and you're not building a cohesive, simple narrative. So, of course, in public forum, it's always a balancing act, right? It's always a balancing act between doing what is technically optimal and then also doing what is most persuasive for the more traditional people that are sitting in the back of the room.
That makes a lot of sense, and that maybe it disrupts the narrative a little bit if you have too much going on.
Right.
Let's listen to Cross and see what happens.
Okay. So, how long has Venezuelan debt been a problem?
I think it's only recently been a problem as it's skyrocketed. Past couple of years. That's when it's getting to the point where defaults are starting to materialize.
So all the economic problems in Venezuela that were existing before sanctions had nothing to do with their debt.
Well, their debt was not significant of a problem before then, but now they are, so they need access to debt restructuring when you lift sanctions. Sure. Can I ask you a question though?
Yeah.
So on your second question about military intervention, you say that as a replacement to sanctions, the United States will do precision strikes, right? With drones, right?
They would lead with precision strike with drones.
Okay, so how at all will that undermine the Maduro regime?
Well, that's what they use at first, before they send the military in. What they use the drone strikes to do is to decimate economic infrastructure, so that they force so that they can occupy Venezuela afterwards,
so
then they can oust Maduro.
Why does destroying homes and businesses, why does that prevent Maduro from being in power.
Well, no. The point is you need the airstrikes as like the precursor to the actual.
Why is that true? Why can't you just?
Because it decimates their ability to actually fight back. Like if you have like drones around in the air dropping bombs on the Venezuelan army, the Venezuelan army is
so
not
it's
going
like
to be able to fight back.
Precision strikes against the military.
Against like the military and like other like things, right? Because the other issue is there's also like guerrilla groups in Venezuela, and so like you have to like strike pretty much everywhere. So let's talk about like the debt thing, right?
Yeah.
So why does resolving the debt crisis mean their economy can grow to?
Well, our evidence specifically says that restores confidence in the Venezuelan economy, and there'll be more investment.
Well,
Can I ask you a question?
So
Yeah.
the investment from the restored confidence in the Venezuelan economy only because they restructured their debt is what is going to cause it to grow twofold, even though it's been going like terribly for like the last 10 years.
That's what our evidence indicates, and if you don't buy that, we give you examples: Mexico, Chile, and Colombia. Can I ask you a question?
Sure.
Okay. So on your second argument, where you talk, or sorry, your third argument on the Monroe Doctrine, you say that Russia uses Venezuela as a proxy, and therefore the U.S. will want to intervene in Venezuela, right?
Right.
So doesn't Russia have many proxies around the world? Why isn't Trump intervened into any of those?
Because the Monroe Doctrine talks about intervention in the Western Hemisphere.
Sure, we have, like, Russia has a lot of proxies in the Middle East, right?
Yeah.
Oh, I see. Wait, so why does it really
Hemisphere.
matter if it's in the West or the East?
Because that's what the Monroe Doctrine says, right? The Monroe Doctrine says
We still do interventions in the East, right? Middle East.
yes, but the point of it's like a foreign policy doctrine that the United States has always followed, is that it will do everything that it can to
I mean,
protect
clearly we
countries in
haven't
the
if we've
Western
done
Hemisphere.
interventions in the Middle East, right?
But the Middle East isn't the Western Hemisphere. That's not the
I'm
Monroe
just saying.
Doctrine.
Well, no, I understand the Monroe Doctrine of
Yeah.
the Western Hemisphere, right?
So
What I'm arguing is that if we have not followed it by intervening in the East, why specifically have we not seen these interventions in Russian
But
proxies in the East?
the East is irrelevant to the Monroe Doctrine because the Monroe
Why is the
Doctrine
Monroe Doctrine
only.
even relevant to your argument?
The
Like,
Monroe
why is it
Doctrine
irrelevant for
says that
intervention?
we have to protect the Western Hemisphere. It says nothing about anything going on in the Middle East.
Okay.
Because like the Middle East wasn't very relevant to the Monroe Doctrine. Like actually seemed like we came to what.
So, can I see if first? Can I see the twice as fast recovery, like the which one? Twice as fast recovery from the second.
What are some of your initial thoughts on Cross there, aside from maybe some of the confusion about the Monroe Doctrine that was avoidable?
Yeah, honestly, like I felt like this cross was a little too in the weeds. I thought both debaters could have done a little bit better of a job of picking the right questions and picking the right chinks in the armor, so that you're picking chinks in the armor where you're attacking sort of fundamental problems with the entire case or the entire argument that are very specific and are specific enough that you can really nail someone down in a speech. But for example, like questions about, like, for example, oh, you say we have proxies in the West, but like we also have them in the East. Like, why does this really matter? To be honest, these are kind of ancillary concerns in my mind. I think much better questions would be, like uniqueness questions for the C2 that we're running, or like link questions for like really is like Hezbollah actually going to be stopped by sanctions on Venezuela, or even uniqueness questions for like Hezbollah in Latin America. Like, I think there's some cognitive problems with the premise of that argument. Like, to be honest, I think we had so many more issues with our case that could have been probed than were explored. And I mean, honestly, yeah, I just feel like both debaters got a little bogged down in the weeds in this cross.
I agree, and I think ultimately the thing to remember is that Cross is not really just about perceptual dominance or scoring points, but using questions to advance a overall strategy. And I think that the more in the weeds you are, the less likely it is that you are really moving the ball towards the goal in terms of your overall strategy. That, like, at the end of this cross, I don't really know what was accomplished necessarily. Maybe there were some perceptual wins here and there, but in terms of setting up the final speech, I don't really know what they accomplished as much.
No, I think that's entirely true. And I honestly don't think that there was even any major significant perceptual wins that happened, because I think the biggest perceptual wins that happen are in some cases tethered to substance, right? The biggest moments where judges will actually remember something that happened in Crossfire is if you had some evidence question that they just weren't able to give a good answer to. And then you also frame the significance of that question like, hey, this is your link evidence. You should be able to answer this question. I just don't think that the concerns raised in Cross like you said, were sufficiently strategically important to make any real, difference in the round.
Totally agree. Okay, let's continue on with the debate.
Start with weighing. Both are contended to impact conflict. Conflict outweighs their case for 4 reasons. First, war is a prerequisite to their case because if conflict happens, there's 100% probability we cannot solve the Venezuelan crisis. Morocco case writes war would destroy all the country's institutions and infrastructure and descend it into permanent anarchy. Secondly, war outweighs the time frame. Recovery requires economic policy to be changed and infrastructure to be built. That takes years. We say America invades as soon as you affirm because there's no other option for Trump, and Hezbollah begins proliferating and inciting conflict in Latin America as soon as funding is secured. Thirdly, we outweigh in magnitude to continue and worsen the crisis and Morocco case explains to add tens of thousands of civilian and combat deaths on top of it when there's a conflict. Fourth, our intervention argument specifically links to extinction. Herrera 19 explains U.S. intervention posed the risk of escalation with Russian troops stationed in the region. Conflict could spiral out of control, leading to U.S.-Russia escalation inadvertently. Extinction comes before all other events because we can't solve any crisis in the entire world if everyone is dead. Group both subpoints. Several trends to the top. First, turn it. Proposal 2019 explains Maduro's economic mismanagement and corruption is the sole reason for the crisis, which is why recovery forecasts between 2021 and 2023 are contingent on Maduro being gone. Sanctions solved. CSIS briefs in 2019 explained sanctions weaken the regime's grip on power through choking off their earnings, which is why Maduro was negotiating as of 3 days ago. Second, turn it again. Because sanctions devastated the Maduro regime's source of revenue through the PDVSA. Artists of 2 days ago explains that sanctions have recently forced Maduro to undergo liberalization to benefit the average Venezuelan, like loosening capital controls, pursuing dollarization, and limiting price controls. The private sector became his only way to get revenue through taxes since they just cut off the public sector. That's like June of last week writes, this is the first time in 3 years Venezuela's economy is improving. Thirdly, the humanitarian crisis getting worse in Venezuela is troubling dining for 3 reasons. A is enriching the elites. Weaver 2018 writes, the government exchange has also turned into a tool to empower Venezuelan leaders. They've sent in billions out of national coffers by exploiting exchange rates rigged to make astronomical profits in the currency transactions. The profits on the government exchange only get bigger with the soaring hyperinflation that continues to destroy the nation's economy. Maduro has a disincentive to solve the problem. B, Maduro has an incentive to keep the average member of the population in destitute poverty because Oppenheimer 19 writes, greater economic collapse would make his population easier to control since it would get rid of millions of discontented Venezuelans. C, the crisis totally preceded sanctions. When in 2019 explains that a year before any financial or sectoral sanctions hit the country, Venezuela's economy was already enduring severe hyperinflation, which surpassed a rate of 800%. This means the linear trend would have continued in either world, even absent sanctions, meaning that we would have inevitably arrived at this point given time through the crisis sooner or later. All these non-uniques mean that even if there would be in a vacuum some marginal offense off of sanctions, but as soon as you lift sanctions, Maduro will just undo whatever positive effect there is. They're plunging his economy back into economic crisis because it's in the best interest to do so. Then on the subpoint A specifically. Firstly, this link concedes the link into our entire case. Insofar as 95% of the government revenue comes from oil, that is the link into our case. Don't let them make any dealings because we have the exact same link. But secondly, they have very, very limited solvency. Look at their specific evidence. I called for multiple cards on this. The problem with all of their evidence is that no study is able to isolate the preceding economic decline which they concede exists in cross from the impact of then sanctions. That's why their study about doubling the rate of improvement literally only looks at 2017 and 2018. These sanctions were implemented in early 2017. You absolutely cannot isolate the effect of sanctions if you're not even looking at the world before sanctions. That's why you know for a fact that there was a crisis pre-sanctions, and if that crisis had continued, it would have reached this point anyways. Then go to subpoint B specifically. Firstly, it's totally not unique. Group 2019 explains Russia is helping Venezuela restructure their debt specifically on the trajectory to fully repay their debts to Russia by the end of this year. Russia is solving. Second, to have access to the international bond market to be beneficial, you still need countries who think your country is viable enough investment and that you're sufficiently likely to pay them back, so the countries will offer to buy your bonds on the market. This means that if we when the crisis exists to any extent in either world, no one wants to loan money to Venezuela. Even if the crisis gets marginally less bad, investor confidence will always be low. Their other examples are not nearly as bad as Venezuela ever was, least of all Mexico. Third, even if people did want to loan to Venezuela, if there's still a crisis, they would probably do it at exorbitant interest rates to compensate for the risk to loaning to Maduro, who we know is incompetent. At that point, they can't afford it. But then, two more trends at the bottom. First, turn it. Cutting off Venezuelan government funds is good because Priosa 2019 explains that the Venezuelan government used those funds to prop up oppressive authoritarian leaders across Latin America. Corey 2013 explains that authoritarian governments are unaccountable to the population and are thus more likely to engage in conflict and more likely to engage in domestic oppression. But then secondly, turn it. Priosa 2019 explains that cutting off the Venezuelan government funds prevents them from propping up narco traffickers, which proliferate addiction, which kills thousands of people. These turns out with their case on scope, this limits the risk of death across the entire region in the world, not just in Venezuela.
The weighing that's at the top of the speech. I think that does a good job capturing what we talked about, that, there's a lot of good stuff going on for the pro in terms of their various internal links to the economy, maybe a little bit less for impact stuff, and I think this speech really capitalizes on that. What do you think about the speech?
Yeah, definitely the weighing was a high point, and the weighing was something that I was able to make in almost every round because every app was the same thing. It would be like one or two contentions about the economy, and then we would just rely on the conflict impact. And until this round, every team would go down with the ship with their case. So yeah, the weighing was definitely good. I think there are some areas where my speech was left something to be desired, though. I think first of all, the disadvantages at the end are just a little too blippy. I don't think I got to them with quite enough time left. I probably should have just read one of them and then done a little bit more warranting on it rather than reading both of them, because I think that they're both just like a little too underdeveloped to like serve as something that we could have seriously gone for later in the round, which would have actually been really useful. So I think that was one mistake, trying to fit in both of them instead of just like fleshing out one of them. Because I mean, I wound up trying to read two like independent DAs in like 25 seconds, which is that's just not enough time for that. I think the second thing is that the speech borders on too technical for the panel. It's certainly walking the line. Yeah, honestly, it is what it is, and I think the rebuttal went very well for us. But, if there was any flaw, it's that, we did have 2 or 3 more like flayed judges on the panel, and a speech like this, you can get away with it in the rebuttal a lot more than you can in the summary or the final focus. But, still a little bit of risky business. Overall, I think this is one of my, better rebuttals that I have up anywhere. I think there's a good mix of case strategy, of offense generation, and then also getting into the weeds on like the evidence debate and the ins and outs of the economics behind the assumptions of their case, their examples, how they're not as severe as Venezuela, all that good stuff. So yeah, I was pretty happy with this rebuttal.
Yeah, I think the thing about the panel is a good point, that sometimes in these speeches when you do need to, sort of just roll and get through a bunch of stuff, you need to still throw a bone to the panel, to those in the panel who are less technical, that you do have to sometimes play to the lowest common denominator in terms of technical proficiency and make sure that, there's something that you leave something in the speech for everyone.
Right, for sure.
Okay, let's keep going through the round.
Overview that the conflict is the most important argument in today's round, so you don't have to evaluate any of their turns about how the economy gets worse. Quickly on the 2 turns that they read at the bottom of our case. First one is that Venezuela uses money to prop up leaders in other countries. No terminalization of this argument at all. How much does this enable oppression in other countries? Which countries are they funding? Is there a single impact of this turn you're not evaluating? Then they say that they'll prop up narco traffickers, but the way the relationship between the government and narco traffickers is that the narco traffickers give money to the Venezuelan government. It's not the other way around. Their evidence also doesn't say what they say it says. Moving on to their case. On to the first contention about terrorism. First of all, according to the Newman in 2019, which is their own evidence, Venezuela has been able to circumvent American sanctions on Latin America because they don't get money from the government, they get money from narco traffickers, which is exponentially increasing in the status quo. Second, according to the Foreign Affairs Institute in 2019, most terrorist attacks are incredibly cheap, and there's no evidence that the current war on terrorist financing has prevented a single terrorist attack. Third of all, according to Ottolenghi in 2018, Hezbollah also gets support from Paraguay, Argentina, and Brazil. And this is a couple of implications. First of all, it means that even if Hezbollah gets shut out of Venezuela, they can just shift their operations to other countries. Second of all, if Hezbollah is more spread out across Latin America, it becomes harder for the U.S. to respond effectively, which A, entrenches Hezbollah in Latin America, and B, makes America more likely to pursue intervention in Latin America. And third, there's absolutely no bright line of their argument. There's no way they can prove they're reducing this one pool of funding from one country to Hezbollah is somehow going to cause this massive resurgence of Hezbollah activity in Latin America. Moving on to their second contention about military intervention. There's 2 reasons why war is more likely in their world. First of all, because according to Stratfor, as they say themselves in their rebuttal speech, sanctions have put a significant strain on this Venezuelan government to the point where it's caused the military to fractionalize in terms of their support against the government, and the military started turning against the government to the status quo. That's really important because according to Stratfor in 2019, the situation in Venezuela is so far entrenched to the point where some of the military believes that if they're kicked out of power, they'll be put on human rights trials and they'll be literally killed and lynched by the population. So essentially the military is being divided into people who are loyal to Maduro and those who are defecting, which is going to cause a civil conflict in Venezuela. This is extremely important because the evidence concludes that if there is a civil conflict between different practices of the military, it will cause a massive refugee crisis, even worse than what we're seeing in the status quo, which A, causes other countries like Colombia to start conflicts with Venezuela, and B, creates a pretext for an American military intervention in Venezuela. The second turn you can read, the second turn is that when we weaken Maduro, it makes it more likely that we see an even worse autocracy in the long term. Because according to Larson in 2019, when we get the military to turn against Maduro using economic sanctions, what's more likely to happen is that a new military leader will simply take over rather than like an opposition or a democratic leader. That's really important because Washington Post finds in 2016 that coups are more likely to lead to new dictatorships that have even more human rights abuses. And so if there are more human rights abuses, that's even a higher incentive for America to intervene in Venezuela, which means, again, it turns all their arguments. On their warrants, first on political support, it's simply not true. According to Time Magazine in 2019, a poll of voters based on race, political affiliation, and age found that literally no voting group wants intervention and Trump's entire political platform is he wants to get out of endless wars. But second of all, they specifically say that he wants to appeal to Cubans and Venezuelans in like Florida. According to The Guardian in 2018, this like voting bloc is moving to the left anyway because they're getting younger and more than because they're getting younger. So it's not like Trump wants to appeal to this voting pool. On their second warrant about oil, according to the Small Bullish Journal, America has due to innovations like fracking, America no longer needs to intervene in Latin America. And B, I'd argue we've definitely learned our lesson from Iraq, for example, where we intervened to get oil. Other argument about Russian influence, first of all, Russia has influence in other countries and we haven't intervened there. Second of all, the Monroe Doctrine hasn't been enforced since literally 1998. There's no reason why we're going to enforce it now. On the talk about war, according to USA Today, America can simply use a non-violent intervention in Venezuela. We do the exact same thing in Colombia, where we simply use the military to help peaceful protesters rather than
So I certainly think that speech is very thorough. I like the structure of this a lot, that it has some sort of top-level answers to the contentions, and then really gets nitty-gritty on some of the warrants. But before we even talk about the way they executed this, interested in your thoughts on the strategy, where they basically just kick all of their initial case, in essence.
Yeah, I mean, to be honest, I think if they hadn't done that, it would have been a much, much easier round for us, because my rebuttal is built on the expectation that teams don't kick their case, right? Our entire strategy is just to dump a bunch of good, true weighing arguments and then a bunch more econ offense and non-uniques. And essentially, if they would have had to, if they wanted to go for their case, they would have had to frontline about 10 to 12 distinct arguments, any one of which could take away essentially all of their offense or turn the case or give us a bunch of offense. So they had two choices here, right? First, they can accept a disadvantage of not having a case and just having to rely on these two turns. Or secondly, they could try to wade through this rebuttal strategy that I had sort of prepared and perfected to beat all these econ cases. And they chose the first option. I thought that, honestly, I think after rebuttals we're ahead. And I think the reason for this is because of the fact that the only thing that they have are these two turns. Now, he does himself a big favor by really warranting these turns well. So he certainly gives himself some room. He certainly gives himself some room to work with in the back half of the round. The reason why I think this strategy works is because of how good University is in the back half, right? University is one of the best back half teams of my senior year, super strategic. And I don't know if you noticed this, but they are just brutally efficient. Cy, their first speaker, was one of the best first speakers in the country. And so, they're certainly not coming out of rebuttals in the best shape. They definitely got some bullet holes coming out of the rebuttals, but they certainly have enough so that they don't have to deal with my rebuttal. They essentially just void my rebuttal, which sucks for me, but is good for them if they can make up for that concession in the back half of the round.
Yeah, I think that the thing to realize is just for them to win on their initial case, they've got to win that their econ impacts outweigh the conflict stuff. Then they actually have to win the econ debate itself, which is sort of a lot to do. And then also putting defense on your case, that's a lot to do in a short speech. So I think it does make a lot of sense to consolidate, especially when your speech was very thorough on the econ stuff. Now they really just can put pressure on you and sort of flip the script and make it so that you're the one who has to really now deal with a boatload of arguments.
Yeah, for sure. Getting a little more nitty-gritty into the speech, I think that the responses on terrorism were actually a lot better than the non-offense response on military intervention. I think that time allocation was still a bit of a concern in the speech. We let them get away with too much in the back half of the round with some of these responses, right? So, for example, the last response about how America could use a nonviolent intervention to help peaceful protesters. Right. Note that this was like 7 seconds, and it didn't have any sort of real warrant or explanation. This is the type of response that when you're frontlining, you need to call out very strongly how underdeveloped it is. Good teams will do this, and we would do this all the time. They'll give a really short response, maybe because they wanted to, maybe because they ran out of time. And then if you don't cover it well and they understand what it could become, they'll blow it up in the back half of the round. And so the antidote to that is to really pin them down onto an under-implicated, under-explained version of an argument immediately after the argument is made.
Yeah, that sounds plausible to me. I think that does sound like it would probably rectify some of the time allocation issues. Cool. Let's keep going with the round.
Let's talk about this term about new dictatorships causing intervention. So in every case in which there is a hostile, or in every case in which there's a dictator in power that is hostile to U.S. interests, do we intervene?
No, but specifically in the context of Venezuela, I can't provide you evidence that America.
Well, you didn't in rebuttal.
I mean,
the problem with your evidence
I would just in rebuttal, I did say that if there is a regime, a new regime that does more human rights violations, that is another pretext for U.S. military intervention.
Okay,
so
pretext, sure. Arguably, you could say, sure.
Okay, yeah. So there is evidence out there saying that the United States has threatened that in the event of mass civilian casualties inflicted by the government, we would do a military.
All right, I'm sure that, I'd like to follow on because I'm sure the U.S. says, wherever there are humanitarian catastrophes, we always intervene. Do we do it with Saudi Arabia? No. Do we do it with any friendly dictators? No. We obviously don't actually do it. Your evidence just says we could use it as a pretext for intervention. Is that how actually, the U.S.'s brain actually works? Absolutely not.
Your entire case is about how America will do a military intervention in Venezuela.
Yes, for different reasons.
Okay, sure. Whether it's I'm just saying this is another reason, right?
No, but that reason doesn't make sense because that reason is that, if a humanitarian catastrophe gets worse and there's a mean leader, the U.S. will take it on itself to intervene. Not true at all, right? That's not how America's foreign policy works. If it is a friendly actor, if it is an actor that is not directly attacking our own interests, we don't intervene. Dude, that logic would have us overthrowing Saudi Arabia tomorrow, but we don't do that because it's a friendly actor. You can have a question. Yeah.
Okay. So, in your rebuttal, do you agree that sanctions are putting immense pressure on the Maduro regime?
Okay, two things. Firstly, that card doesn't talk about pressure. Secondly, you can't just say...
I'm not saying yes or no.
No. It's not a yes or no question. So I know what you're getting at, and I'm going to actually address the point of this question. And the point of this question is to say,
Jack,
sanctions...
It was a really simple question.
Right.
Saying,
so
do you agree, as you said, quote in your rebuttal, according to CSIS, sanctions have significantly weakened the regime?
Yeah,
do you agree that sanctions have significantly
I'll answer that with a counter question. Are all forms of pressure the same?
Jack, just answer the question.
yeah, it's pressure. Sure, yes.
Yeah,
my question to you is, are all forms of pressure the same?
No.
Obviously not. So your evidence doesn't talk about sanctions. Obviously, if all forms of pressure triggered intervention, the fact that we would call diplomats from Venezuela would have caused the crisis. It didn't cause the crisis.
Okay, the judges can call for evidence. It is about sanctions on Venezuela.
No. It doesn't talk about. Wait. I didn't see that part of the part. I asked you to trigger was it sanctions. It wasn't.
No, that was the second turn. And for the first turn, it is about. Regardless, we're getting into meaningless.
Sure.
Question.
So just to be clear, your only offense in the round is the 2 turns on CT.
I also wrote the third one.
I thought it was good. We got a little snarky, got a little sassy. But yeah, I thought it was a fine cross-ex. Honestly, nothing too significant happened. He kind of clowned me a little bit for refusing to give a yes or no answer, which was fair. Probably should have just said yes. But yeah, I thought Cross was good. I think that I won the first exchange about the underlying warrant he's making that if there's a humanitarian crisis, we automatically intervene. I think my point about how if you look around in the world, we don't do that in every humanitarian crisis. I think I win that exchange. I think he comes out ahead on the next exchange, which is sort of about the whole pressure question. And then that was the bulk of Cross. The last question I asked was just to make sure I wasn't missing anything, and to also sort of subliminally remind the judges where we are at in the round after rebuttals, which is that the only offense they have were a couple of turns in rebuttal, and that their case is gone. That was kind of my intent behind that question, just sort of, remind everyone where we're at.
Totally makes sense, yeah. And I think that this cross-ex may have fallen prey in some ways to a little bit the missing the forest for the trees thing as well, that we talked about in the first one, that I'm not sure what stuff really seems to implicate overall strategy that you'll be going for here. It seems like you had some good concessions, but at the same time, I'm not sure if you really moved the needle as much in terms of overall strategy. What do you think?
Yeah, that's true. There certainly wasn't any big important strategy questions that were addressed. I would say that the one strategic component of my question about not all humanitarian crises trigger intervention is that the piece of prereq weighing that was sort of subtly made by them after one of the turns in 5 seconds of time was that if their turn is true and they link into a crisis, a worsening humanitarian crisis, that serves as a pretext for an American intervention. And so in that way, my question was trying to get at that, which I think is one of the bigger threats, which is that they win a turn and then they win weighing off of the turn, which is sort of essentially what wound up costing us the round.
Well, on that note, let's see the rest of the round.
Okay. Is everybody ready? On the first contention, we concede only defense. That's not what the debate is happening. Let's go to our second contention. They completely concede versus the Towser evidence, which indicates that the only two options that Trump has are sanctions or military intervention against Venezuela. The second thing they concede is the Jacobs evidence, which says that any strategic change in foreign policy towards Venezuela has to be the next step off the escalation ladder, and the thing that is the next step off the escalation ladder is in fact military intervention. So far as that uniqueness is conceded, we have in this round we've established that there's literally the binary between sanctions and intervention. That's going to take out a couple of their responses, but I'll implicate it later. Let's extend the oil link. The war evidence says that Trump would otherwise go to war in Venezuela to get access to all of the oil in Venezuela because they compete directly with the American oil companies. Our Roche evidence indicates that because that sanctions are getting that job done by cutting Venezuelan oil off from the markets where the United States oil companies compete. Let's look at their link specific responses first of all. Their only response to this link specifically is that they no longer need to compete. They no longer need to compete because of fracking. But fracking doesn't give you nearly as much oil to nearly enough oil to outcompete our number one competitor. And second of all, if fracking gives you a different kind of oil than the oil that Venezuela produces. So let's talk about their turns, which are really important. First of all, on the Stratford turn, 6 responses. One, we would say extend the rented in 19 is conceded in oil. The crisis is terminally not unique because it happened because of the economic crisis happened because of other issues. The Stratford says that it's a humanitarian crisis that turns the population against them. Second, you can turn the turn. If we cut off sanctions to the military, Maduro will not be strong enough to attack the opposition. But third of all, we'd say if the United States doesn't want war, they can just restrain opposition. Fourth, you can answer this with uniqueness. We'd say that there have been sanctions happening for years and that this hasn't happened yet. Fifth, we would say that due to last week explains that the forces are actually turning away from the opposition and back towards Maduro because of a scandal that happened with the opposition party. But sixth of all of that argument assumes that their entire military has defected. Their evidence is talking about several high-up members of the military that's different than literally the entire army going with them. Let's talk about their second turn. 4 responses. One, we'd say that we don't intervene against most dictators in most crises. It's a super weak strength of blame. We only intervene unless they're actually in massive problems. But second of all, if we were to institute a regime change, we'd probably institute a friendly dictator, a friendly replacement, in which case we wouldn't actually need any sort of intervention. But moreover, let's look a little bit deeper at their actual evidence. First of all, their evidence doesn't talk at all about sanctions. But second of all, we call for that evidence. That evidence talks about military, overthrowing him with the military through a military coup, not through United States intervention, which means that which means that it has literally no link into our case whatsoever. That's literally reliant on the first turn. It's just an implication of the first turn. Call for that evidence. It has nothing. It doesn't say at all what they say it says. So on the bottom, on the impact defense on the bottom about no military intervention, that evidence says that the United States can literally just train Colombians to fight instead. So you still have the military intervention impact, and plus that's answered by uniqueness. The Telesur and the Jacobs evidence says that military intervention is literally the only alternative. The impact is when invasion happens, that means that 8 million refugees happen, the Venezuelan economy goes into anarchy, but we both.
So I'm interested in what you think. I think overall it's strong, but I do think there are some areas where time allocation feels off. So I'm not sure about these 6 answers to the Stratford card, for example. That feels like they're a little bit blippy, and I'm just not sure if that really is the area that requires the most time. What do you think?
Yeah, that's fair. I think that the biggest thing that was missing from this summary, and also probably from my final focus, is link weighing. I think there needed to be, 3 to 4 quick arguments, or maybe 2 to 3 quick arguments that are made as to why our link, and just explicitly framed as such, why our link into military intervention is so much better, so much clearer than their links into military intervention. I think that if we had had some of this just top shelf comparative work done, it would have made the rest of the round way easier. And they actually wind up sort of doing this in the next speech. Cy really gives a fire summary, and so we start to kind of have to claw, and I don't really execute that well. One more thing that I would say about this speech is that there are like small problems, and overall definitely a solid speech for sure. There are small problems that I think come from like how, I guess, blippy parts of the second rebuttal were. Like some of these arguments he's spending like 7 seconds on, so it kind of makes sense that we're missing it. But for example, the Iraq argument, he spends about 5 seconds on. We don't explicitly respond to that. And then that sort of like impact defense at the bottom. The way we handled the whole Colombia impact defense at the bottom, I think was a bit of a disservice for us, because the whole warrant about like training Colombian soldiers wasn't really present in the round until this speech, right? Because we called for the card and all of that stuff. And then we started to explain their warrant for them just for a few seconds. And so now that opens the door to let them talk about the warrant. Whereas what we probably should have done is just say, hey, there wasn't a warrant for this, right? There wasn't a warrant for how a non-violent intervention could like destroy the entire country. And now it's too late for them to give any warrant for that since it wasn't in the rebuttal. So yeah, those are my thoughts. Those are the areas where we kind of got burned.
Makes sense. Yeah, I think the thing about weighing is especially important. Debaters often are good at impact weighing, because that's often very neat and simple. It's just like econ versus conflict. But there's not often an easy label for, different types of link weighing, but it's equally important because you need to explain why the judge should prioritize your link argument over your opponent's. So I think that's just a thing that is sometimes less intuitive to debaters, but definitely needs to have been present.
Yeah, that's definitely true. I always am trying to work with my kids about link weighing. It's not a skill that comes easily or naturally. It's a lot more complex. So that's a good point. And yeah, it's something we could have internalized a lot better in this round. That's for sure.
Let's keep going through it.
So I'm going to just start off on, their second mention. Yeah. All right, is everyone ready? My opponents go for their second warrant, where they specifically talk about oil. They drop Sukum's second response, which specifically says that the United States has learned its mistake from Iraq. The U.S. doesn't want any of these costly interventions. They completely drop this piece of defense. That is really crucial, because that means they have no access to any offense in their case. So virtually there is no way to vote for them. With that being said, the only place you can really vote is our term, where we specifically tell you from Stratford that when you have increased pressure from their own CSA evidence, that'll only lead to military fracturing, and that's really crucial, because if like half the military is divided and being pro-Maduro and half isn't, that'll lead to a civil conflict. They give you 6 responses to this. First, they say it's not unique, but they say the economic crisis is not unique, but they give you the CSAS evidence themselves that says that the sanctions actually increase pressure. Moreover, some of the sanctions aren't economic sanctions. They specifically target key individuals in the Maduro regime, so they are unique. And they talk about how it's like not like they're not strong, but we specifically tell you like sanctions made Maduro not strong, so we can't instigate conflict. But just because you have sanctions, that doesn't mean that like the Maduro regime and the military don't have guns. They can still initiate a conflict, which would be deadly. And they talk about how they'd be restrained. But like that, our argument is about the military, and the U.S. can't specifically restrain the military. That is an independent entity from the U.S. And they talk about how they're winning on uniqueness. But according to FARR, Maduro is tapping into his last gold reserves. Because of sanctions, we're going to see in 2020 specifically that this whole scenario will actually pan out. And they talk about how they're shying away from the opposition. One, realize that even if they're shying away from the opposition, they're much more likely to shy away from Maduro. But second, realize that the warrant that they give you is a corruption scandal. Corruption scandals are pretty short term, and in long term, what we're saying is that with sanctions, what we're actually going to see is this conflict actually escalate. And they talk about how like our argument is about the entire army defecting from Maduro. That is not our argument at all. Our argument is precisely the opposite. We say that if some of the military doesn't and some of the military does, that leads to a civil conflict in the first place. That is really crucial, because they drop the weighing. Specifically, what we say is that our conflict outweighs what they say, because we lead to this civil war happens as well, which kills thousands of people, but that also is a pretext for the conflict that they talk about. So in their world, you only have a U.S. intervention. In our world, there's only a U.S. intervention, but in their world, you see a U.S. intervention as well as a civil conflict. Moreover, another reason why why you're not going to vote for them is our USA Today evidence specifically says that you can do non-violent interventions that's specific to the U.S. They respond in two ways. First, say that you train Colombians to fight, but our evidence specifically says that they're not trained to fight militarily. They're trained to do peaceful protests and peaceful revolts, and that's really crucial because in Colombia it was successful. Then they talk about how it didn't really work and it was like a military solution. But our example from Colombia specifically says that it did work and it was actually peaceful. It didn't lead to any. That's my point to talk about. This is really crucial because what that means is essentially that they have no impact on losing lives. They say that fracking in Venezuela produce different types of oil, which means we don't compete with Venezuela and we don't have time to intervene. That's really crucial at the end of the day because there's no reason to vote for them.
I remember thinking like, oh crap, after this summary finished, because the biggest strategy that we tried to do in the previous summary didn't work, which was that we tried to just overwhelm the turns with responses in hopes that he would just drop one of them and we would just easily be able to be like, hey, look at what's happening on the flow. They dropped response to their turn, but we frontlined everything on case. And it didn't work for two reasons. The first reason it didn't work is because he gave pretty good front lines that I think were equally as blippy as our responses. So we really didn't have like obvious wiggle room with our responses to his turns. And then the second reason it didn't work is that he kind of started the speech with like this blow up of the Iraq response, which like, honestly, I thought, I mean, like truth wise, the Iraq thing was like a several second analytic in rebuttal. And we went from like a 7-second analytic to like, they have no offense from their entire case. So, you know, I mean, it's obviously a little bit of a stretch, but it's still putting us on the defensive, right? This whole speech puts us on the defensive in the first final focus, which, you know, has to adjudicate between 6 minutes of content throughout the two summaries. And what winds up happening is that they also come out with this wang, which is that, okay, the comparative for them is that if you vote for them, you avoid 2 interventions versus 1, because they get this whole civil war thing that they avoid as well. And so, you know, overall, I think that the tide starts to shift after the summaries. I think it's a good speech. I think it's a very efficient speech. So, yeah, those are my thoughts.
Yeah, I really think that the part at the top about no intervention, Iraq taught us a lesson. I agree with you. There's some proportionality stuff between, you know, how long it was in the earlier speech and where it is now. But I certainly think it's a perceptually good place to start because it doesn't seem like there's a super clear response to it initially. And then you're able to say, look, that sort of just takes out a lot of their case. Intervention is not going to happen. Sanctions only fracture the military. But there's this uniqueness question that, like, we're going to intervene invariably goes out the window. So I think that was a perceptually good place to start. And I think it's also the right route of attack for the pro here, that like if they win that intervention is not going to happen in the status quo, there's maybe not as much of a reason for why sanctions are necessary. Sanctions don't look as much like the lesser of two evils.
Yeah, and you know that's something that good teams are great at doing, which is that on a big messy flow, they'll find the one thing that you misunderstood or totally didn't respond to, and then they'll blow it up and give a really simple, intuitive reason why it changes the round in such a way that they're now winning, you know? And I think that this speech is a great example of that.
Mm-hmm. Cool. Let's keep going.
Since when has the United States ever learned its lesson from something that it did in the 20s?
Well, okay, so first of all, I don't think that Brad cost time for you to like.
Well, it's fully not. It was also a 5-second analytic at the end of her book. And it was also
it's still defense here. Like you can't just not
saying a claim that the U.S. has learned its lesson is not in response to the specific evidence that there's zero bizarre whatsoever.
I give you one thing in my summary, which is that we've learned our lesson. Iraq was a failure, and we aren't going to do something similar
right.
to that.
And the entirety of our link is specific to the Trump administration. Is that evidence specific to the Trump administration?
Oh, it's not.
I mean, also, once again, you could have said this in summary, but you did not.
No, hold on. If you were not answering our link, you can say whatever you want and drop it. You're not, though, because our link is specifically 100% specific to what the Trump administration thinks. If you're just saying the U.S., not naming who thinks this, has learned its lesson from Iraq, and you're not even equating it to the actor that goes to war, then you're not responding to that answer at all.
The other thing that answers that is the conceded uniqueness evidence, which indicates that there is literally
there's no other option.
Okay,
There's no
that
other option.
doesn't make any sense because we give you evidence saying there is
Well, that does.
Wait. No.
Tell us your evidence.
So, first of all, just like you say it's specific to Trump, I'd say it's even more, the response is even more true for Trump, because like one of Trump's biggest rallying points in his election is I'm going to get out of endless wars.
You should have interpreted it to our
Yeah,
I mean,
wait, that warranty should have been somewhere in the ground, rather than 5 seconds.
You can't expect us to like frontline that preemptively because you said nothing about
you
this.
didn't actually make it answer our link, though. It's not even a front line. It's
Wait a
like
second,
making it answer our link.
What do you mean? Like, we gave you this response, you did not respond to it in summary, now you're expecting us to respond to your response to it.
It wasn't responsive to the link. Please say you should have made it responsive to the link, i.e. making it about
Then why didn't you say any of that in summary?
because it didn't answer the link. If you make a
Straight up
non-responsive
did not
argument,
answer the
But
even if
wait,
your
so it explained why it is responsive now. Like, insofar as you don't mention this at all in summary. Like, if you did mention this in summary that it was not responsive, you could explain why it was.
No.
We actually did in the quote.
Okay, wait, so why is it responsive?
As Sukum just explained.
Okay,
One
so
of the
it's
key priorities of the
responsive
Trump
because of an
administration.
argument. It's for your defense is responsive because of an argument you haven't made in a speech yet.
No. The reason why we didn't make this in speech is that you didn't respond to it in your speech.
You can't make a response and then explain why it's a response, like in final focus.
Also, wait.
We can
Like it's
like,
literally the equivalent to like just saying some
Let's just move on, because I think
random
this is just like a technicality in the debate. You
Yeah,
guys
do you want a question? We just
oh, you just asked it. Okay. So why is it the military like the only option, as you say in your case? Because we can give you examples where it wasn't, like specifically like in Colombia, like the only instance where we did an intervention in South American country that wasn't actually like that's one a really clear instance.
First of all, that's not true at all. Like you first of all can see
Well, actually,
it's the only alternative. Second of all, the
USA
Columbia scenario hasn't happened. It's the only
the
alternative.
evidence from USA Today explains that there's been no military operation where you try to depose a leader specifically through intervention militarily. Like historically, what we've seen is that the only
That's definitely
Evidence from cases we've done it 56 times.
No, but like the most recent times we've done it have not been what you say. Like your evidence says, like I think the last instance your evidence was in 1998.
So my initial thought on that, I think that it seems like there's a lot of pushback about whether or not Grand Crossfire can ask about this whole, Iraq. We learned our lesson from Iraq thing. What do you think? Do you think this is too new of an argument? What do you really make of that exchange?
I mean, I think like anything is fair game in Grand Cross. Usually in PF, when people say, "Oh, it's too late for this in Grand Cross," it's usually just like posturing. Like I've said that 100 times, and it's pretty much just like a way to tell the judge like it's too late for this, and then you actually wind up talking about it. My thoughts are that I think that I fall into a classic trap in this Grand Cross, which is like, you feel like either you're losing or you're made anxious by how close the round is at this point as the second speaker. And so you then try to get super involved in Grand Cross to like try and persuade people, try to bring it back. Ultimately, I spent most of Cross actively engaged, which is something I don't think any second speaker should do in the Grand Crossfire. I think the second speaker should spend probably the first 30 seconds and the last 30 seconds engaged in Grand Cross, and just spend the rest of the time just prepping the final focus. We also didn't have that much prep left, and we had to call a couple cards. So not very strategic play on my part. I kind of let the heat of the moment get the better of me at this point.
That makes sense. And even, it's a useful lesson that can even happen to a TOC champion. Sometimes getting caught up in the heat of the moment, and it's important just to maintain your cool and really figure out what strategy you want to adopt from, a rational standpoint, not firing from the hip.
Absolutely. Yeah, it's being able to coldly make decisions about when to speak and when not to speak is certainly easier said than done in a high-pressure environment, that's for sure. I also think that, Grand Crossfire is infamously messy and bickery, and I don't think this is that much of an exception. I think that that's something that we could have done better. I could have done better, talk over people a little bit less, interrupt a little bit less. But yeah, that's my 2 cents there.
Yeah, it makes sense. Let's see what happens next.
It's going to be yes. Is everyone ready?
start in our case, extend the telescope evidence that explains if it's not for military intervention, it is, or rather, if it's not for sanctions, there's only one other option, which is military intervention. This guarantees that after sanctions, there's one thing that the Trump administration can do, and that's proven by the also conceded Jacobs evidence explaining that the Trump administration has decided that any strategic changes it makes towards the Venezuelan situation will be followed by more aggressive actions. The only thing above that is war, which means access 100% strength of link. And this is important because A, their only defense is totally not specific to the Trump administration, and B, it is not even evidence, it's exclusively a random unwarranted analytic. We have evidence to always evaluate this clash in our favor insofar as all their responses have absolutely no evidence. With that said, let's have the link on oil. We say specifically that sanctions eviscerate and otherwise huge Venezuelan oil threat, which directly competes with U.S. industries, and at that point, there's no longer the need for Trump to invade. They have a couple of responses. The first thing that they extend is this thing that the U.S. has learned its lesson. But firstly, this is wholly non-responsive. It is first not even talking about what the Trump administration thinks. Call for our card from war. Trump specifically and explicitly said that the risk that he had made Venezuela is tied to how he wants the oil. He clearly has not. The link disproves this argument entirely. But then secondly, this is a totally unwarranted blip that was in for 5 seconds in rebuttal. You should not feel comfortable even coming close to voting on this. But then they say that Trump wouldn't want to intervene. But then they concede Jacobs and saying there was literally no other option. At that point, he literally can do nothing else but intervene. At that point, let's answer the impact events. They say that we can just peacefully through Colombia. We cannot accomplish the goal of literally weakening the entire country through just having some Colombian interventionists go in peacefully. This backlight made absolutely zero sense. At that point, you do not evaluate the argument whatsoever. With that said, let's extend to answers to their turn. Firstly, they drop the fact that you can turn the turn because we say that the sanctions specifically make the Maduro regime much weaker. That means he's not strong enough to attack Venezuela. Yes, sure, the military still exists, but at that point, he can't attack. But then secondly, remember, their argument is that insofar as there is ever a humanitarian crisis that makes people disaffected, which overthrows Maduro, they can see that the humanitarian crisis is non-unique. At that point, the dynamic that would cause their term to exist exists in either world. That's why we win their turn on this.
I think one thing is that there could be a little bit more on some of the arguments that the prior speech is really going hard for. So I think in particular we've learned our lesson from the Middle East. There's no real incentive to do anything with oil because things like fracking allow diversification. I think it just could have been a little bit more in the weeds in places. But I'm curious what you think, considering you're the one who gave the speech.
Yeah, no. Honestly, I think I sat down after the speech. I was like, oh, man, that was not it. It wasn't my most efficient speech. A lot of fluency breaks. But that wasn't the biggest problem. The biggest problem in my mind was the lack of weighing, the continual lack of link weighing and clean, clear comparative work done between the turn offense and the case offense. What wound up happening is, I think that I handled the Iraq thing decently well by pointing out that, hey, it's this unwarranted analytic. It doesn't have evidence. And if anything, I think I might spend too much time on it because I kind of make those points in two separate places throughout the speech. And the problem that happens here is that 5-second response in rebuttal winds up costing me 20 seconds in final focus because the second summary was able to turn it into a big problem for me. You know what I mean? And so that's great summary work right there because now that's 20 seconds that I could have been making one or two good link weighing arguments with that maybe could have changed the tide of the round. So honestly, I think that the biggest problem with this speech was issue prioritization and efficiency. I think those were the two biggest things that prevented this speech from really being as good as it could have been. Because this speech, to really win over a 5-person panel in a round that's as tight as this round is, you need to really give a great speech once you're, if anything, marginally behind. And I don't think this speech was that. And I also think that the second final focus was very solid as well. So, yeah.
Yeah, I totally get that. Let's see what happens with the next one.
Our evidence is so explicit that in Colombia, when we had the option to do a military intervention, we didn't do a military intervention. Rather, we just sent the military to Colombia and trained the Colombian forces how to do non-violent protests. And the evidence is so explicit that it was successful and led to a long-term reduction in human rights violations in Colombia. And the evidence concludes that we can do the exact same thing in Venezuela. And this is so much more likely than their link because it's so much more politically palatable and it's for the Trump administration to do a non-violent intervention compared to a violent one. Their entire final focus is just there are only two options, war and peace. That doesn't make any any sense. We give you the Colombia example in summary that they can see that that isn't the only option. We can always do a non-violent intervention. Then on the turn, they make two responses in final focus, neither of which answer the turn at all. First one is that the humanitarian crisis is non-unique. That's not responsive to our argument. We say from the CSI evidence that they read in their own rebuttal that we do specifically targeted sanctions against the military. So even if there's a humanitarian crisis, we specifically target the military, which causes certain factions of the military to break off from the government. Then they say that if we sanction them, they're cut off from their weapons. But that doesn't make any sense. Just because we have sanctions on Venezuela doesn't mean they don't have guns. No warranting, no explanation. That's really important because that means we link it to our Stratford evidence, which explains that if we have sanctions on Venezuela, that will divide the military and cause a conflict between the military, which leads to a civil war in Venezuela. And they also concede the weighing on this turn, which then in their world, in our world, if they win their link, there's just a U.S. military intervention. In their world, there is a civil war and a U.S. military intervention because America would have to intervene to stop that civil war. This weighing is 100% conceded, and we read it in summary. For all these reasons, and because there really aren't just two options, there's three options.
All right, let's talk about that last speech and the round as a whole. I think the speech does a good job, flagging some concessions from the prior final focus, namely this, it's not a binary, there's this third option of, what we did in Colombia, because I think that really does short-circuit a bit this uniqueness push that's just, either sanctions or something really bad is going to happen. So I thought that was well done. What do you think?
Yeah, I fully agree. I think that he compensates for a lack of that type of argumentation with just making a lot of sense and also probably explaining things in a way that's more friendly to the traditional judges on the panel. The other thing that I think is strategically very intelligent in the speech is that he actually pivots away from the Iraq defense and towards the Colombia defense in the speech. And I think that's smart because after the summaries, Iraq seemed to be a big threat. Now, Colombia was still there in the summary, so I think it's fair play to do that in the final focus. But I spent, a much larger share of my time trying to deal with this Iraq thing because, we technically did drop it. And so what he does is he essentially, I don't know if he totally kicks that or what, but he spends 30 seconds just sitting on this Colombia defense that was, as I pointed out, 6 or 7 seconds practically and not nearly as warranted in the rebuttal. And that's just sort of the nature of the game with smart teams, right? Because that's the right play because it's still in the round. There have, in fact, been conversations about the internal warrant, thanks partially to us. And so now he's just added with a really solid, clean, 20 to 30 seconds spent on warranting in the speech, he's added a clear thing that I think one or two of the judges actually wound up voting off of it in terms of a reason why they preferred the turn to our case. So yeah, that was one thing that the speech did really well. And like I said before, I think the speech was great for traditional judges as well. I liked the little conclusion at the end, the cute little catchphrase. I thought that was well done. Overall, I think they're just one step ahead of us on the comparative. I think that there's certainly an argument to be made that the uniqueness argument takes out the turns, and that our case was just better developed with evidence, better frontlined, and you don't buy the Columbia thing because of whatever responses. But this decision was a 3-2. So, obviously there is a path to the ballot for both sides. And I think after this speech, certainly in my mind, a good enough job was done to, really deserve that win with this panel.
Let's talk about some of the main takeaways, moving to a level of abstraction beyond just this debate. I think some of the takeaways that I see. First, I think weighing is very important. I think that was one of the good things about your initial speech, that it started out with a lot of weighing, and I think that was one thing that made the debate a little bit confusing later on, is the lack of link weighing at various portions. I think the second big takeaway that I see is just make the debate smaller. Both teams really collapsed down to one issue at the end: who causes more conflict, and specifically, who incentivizes an intervention. And I think the debate getting smaller is important because larger debates introduce more variability and just generally have less explanation going on. And I think the third and final thing I'll say is just be careful about arguments being blown disproportionately up in later speeches. Like this, we learned our lesson from Iraq thing, I think ends up just turning into a really big thing, and it was just 5 seconds in an earlier speech, so it's important to be cognizant of that, I think. What are some of your takeaways?
Yeah, those are three really good takeaways. That honestly covers the vast majority of it for me. Two more for me would be as follows. First, the reason that they, in the end, were able to win this round is because they were able to kick their entire case when they needed to. In PF, that's something that most teams aren't comfortable doing. Most teams wouldn't be able to kick case, especially not in the second rebuttal, and just rely straight up on their turns and then their comfort in the back half to really win the round. So if you can develop the ability to really close out a round on a non-case position, that's a hugely important tool to have in your arsenal that can help you win a lot of high-level rounds that you could lose otherwise. The second big takeaway is don't go down rabbit holes, right? And this kind of speaks to your point about how, there really wasn't like that much weighing in the back half of this round. And I think the reason for that is that in one speech or another, I think it was probably my partner's Morgan's speech, we made a decision that, okay, we're just going to like drown their two turns with just like a bunch of responses. And then I think every other debater in the round then makes the mistake to not step outside of that and say, okay, like, yes, there's a bunch of ink on my flow. And yes, my gut response is to put ink next to that ink. But what needs to happen is that you need to be putting ink in a separate place, which is to make independent link weighing responses that apply to all of the offense in the round. So don't get sucked down a rabbit hole, right? If your opponents start making a bunch of nitty gritty arguments on like substance, that's fine. You deal with that, but don't let it prevent you from making necessary weighing arguments that you need to win the round.
Yeah, I agree with all that. And I think that hopefully those takeaways are helpful for, future debates, not just analyzing this one. So I think that about does it. Thanks for taking the time to analyze this round with me. It was a good round, and I hope everyone watching learned something.
Thanks, guys. Hope everyone enjoyed this. And if you want to work with me and Rafi, go ahead and head over to DebateDrills.com, go to the PF section. And thanks so much, everyone.
Have a good one.